This is Dan Schneider. On this Dan Schneider video interview, the subject is pornography, its history, and any misconceptions about it. I am speaking with Clarissa Smith. She is an expert on the topic, and the conversation will begin when we return. The subject is pornography. Clarissa Smith has written much about the topic. She is my guest, and before I get too far into it, I want to ask a little bit about yourself and why you have written on pornography, what you find interesting about it, and some of the works that you have about it. So, Clarissa, welcome, and if you could give a little background about yourself.
Okay, thanks for having me on here. I teach at a university in the UK, and my subject area really is media and cultural studies, but my particular focus is on pornography. So what drew me to that was basically just, really the ways in which different kinds of arguments get made about pornography, that it's a kind of repository for a whole host of fears, whether that's about young people or about men and their relationships with women, or about whether or not women are out of control, or, there's a whole host of ways in which pornography becomes a kind of touch point or a node for different kinds of worries about sex, sexuality, sexual identity, what kinds of things people are looking at, questions around the legality of representations, so a whole host of things. And so, pornography is really endlessly interesting in terms of the ways it gets talked about. And then, of course, it's one of those things that we talk about endlessly, but we know very little about it, in that the histories are always very partial. They're often about histories of censorship rather than of the medium itself. And so, it's just an endlessly fascinating area to be researching in. And there's been, since the mid-1990s, there's been a really burgeoning field around pornography, people who want to research it from different angles, so legal, but also from audience perspectives, textual perspectives, different histories of different genres, but also, thinking about gay porn, queer porn, feminist porn, mainstream porn, niche porn. So, I've been really lucky to have lighted on a group of colleagues as well that I could explore things with, and that's how the journal came around as well, was just a realization that now might be a good time to be exploring some of these issues, and that we could get a publisher involved in that as well. So that's quite a lengthy answer to your question, but hopefully useful.
Well, I recently did a show with a fellow who studies UFOs in a larger cultural context, and there's always, with these kinds of topics, people go back thousands of years. They might have seen a UFO or claimed to, get Ezekiel's wheel. Similarly, in pornography, people say you can look back on writings from thousands of years ago. You can look back on graffiti from thousands of years ago to see, images of large penis and big breasted women having sex here, there, in various cultures. So does pornography, as we currently understand it, go back thousands of years, or is that, or are these, images of people fucking in ancient cultures from across Asia and Europe and possibly elsewhere? Is pornography an ancient thing?
Well, I think certainly images of humans having sex is clearly has a very long history. What those images might mean will be quite different from, we've got to be wary of looking back from now and looking back on those images. But one thing's for sure is that, lots of cultures have had images of sexual activity, whether it's fucking or other kinds of sexual activity, and that they've been important forms of representation. Currently, we live in quite a I hate using the term schizophrenic, because I think that it's a kind of pathologizing term, but we do live in a quite contradictory culture around sex, or a culture that explores various contradictions about sex. So on the one hand, we have forms of celebration of sexuality, and on the other, a lot of angst about whether or not it should be rendered absolutely illegal, that our kids and others should be prevented from seeing it. And clearly in ancient times, the chances were that there was less sense of a need to prohibit those images, or to keep them away from public places or whatever. But I think, I'd be really careful about offering false equivalences between imagery produced in a cave with, forms of ink or paint made from earth, with materials that are produced using cameras and digital equipment. But the impulse to record sexual activity seems to have been, it does have a very long history, and I think it's really important that we recognise that there is a very long history, that and also that attempts to suppress or to publicise imagery of sex also have their histories too. And we live in a particular time right now. The 1800s offered a very different take on imagery of fucking, and so will the Middle Ages, and going further back, right? So, yeah. I mean, I think these are all avenues that we really need to explore, and to recognise the cultural and the historical specificities, as well as drawing, connections between those sets of images. Because, it is a really interesting question to raise. What connections might there be between Greek representations of sex and what we're seeing currently in online? But I'm not that kind of historian, actually. So yeah.
In America in the 1960s and 70s, there was sort of infamously pornography was defined as, I can't really define it, but I know it when I see it kind of argument. Has that been true in the UK and elsewhere around the world?
Yeah, I think that's the definitions of porn are really difficult, right? And actually, even if you're coming from a quite positive position around pornography, it can be difficult to define. But for those who are really censorious about porn, well, they're the ones who tend to go for that idea of, I don't need to define it, I know it when I see it. Yeah. The problem with that, of course, is that actually almost anything can be read pornographically, if what we mean by reading what's porn. If porn is about arousal, then people get aroused at really quite ordinary kinds of representations. That you can feel a sexual affect or a sexual response to something that another person would consider to be really innocuous. And certainly in research that I've done with audiences around pornography, you can't find people who will talk about the same things as being absolutely sexy or sexual or pornographic. Instead, what you get is this kind of really movable feast, and it really stretches out. And so for some people, especially when you're talking to young people, porn would be, really kind of images of people kissing very passionately and for a long time, whereas for someone else, porn requires nakedness and penetration, right? So it is really difficult to define, and for legislation, people. Certain policymakers, certainly in the UK, have thought that it's really easy to define pornography, but it actually isn't, and it is a bit of a mess, that kind of definition. Yeah, I'm not sure I've answered your question there, but in the early 2000s in the UK, we debated and then passed legislation which sought to outlaw extreme pornography. And the definition of extreme is really loose. There were elements in clauses that that try to call upon ideas of realism, but realism is really hard to define as well. So, it's when you're trying to define images, generally it does tend to come down to, well, I'm the lawmaker or I'm the law enforcer, and I'm disgusted by this, therefore it is pornography. I mean, there are obviously sets of text, films, images, stories that are defined as porn by the people who write them and publicise and sell those products as pornography. But often, when we're talking about legislation, then actually it's a much broader set of materials that can fall foul of legislation around pornography. So, yeah, it does tend to be something that is just sort of smelt out by people, or they have a disgust response to it, and they believe that is a good enough indication that something is wrong with the materials. So,
it's when I was born in 1965, so the 1970s was sort of the golden age of pornography in terms of film in America. You had Deep Throat and Debbie Does Dallas, which were two famed porno movies here. And I always use the term porno versus porn, because in America we have PAWN, pawn shops, rather than porn houses. So when I grew up, it was porno and porn. But going back, and let's just go to film for a moment. There were always what were called stag films in the 30s and 40s, and then they were called blue films. And then I guess by the 1960s, with the counterculture, they came out as pornography or porn, whatever you want to call it, flesh films, skin flicks. And yet that they did seem kind of mainstream in that it was usually mostly, at least what played in most theaters that were in New York, big cities, was sort of straight white male sex, male on female sex, heterosexual activity. And then there was sort of even that subgenre of what I would be called Eurotrash films. You had films like Salo or 60 Days in Savna. And then you had things like bestiality magazines and coprophilia, necrophilia, snuff films. What in the history of film has there been a pornography? Has it gone more towards the sensational, or is now, with everyone being able to make their own pornography in their homes, is it back more to just like, I'm the pool boy, I'm coming and there's the big-titted woman who is going to seduce me kind of fantasy?
Well, I mean, it's really interesting, the kinds of, there are sort of openings up at different historical points and then closing down. Yeah. And some of that seems to be about distribution, I think, as much as anything else, right? That, when you're talking about materials coming into America that are labeled as European, that is about distribution channels and the opening up of particular kinds of materials being possible to purchase in different places, transporting it and stuff. It's quite a lot in inside your question there, right? That needs, I guess, to be unpacked. For sure, in the 30s and 40s, 50s and 60s, really, because the equipment is large, and that's the equipment to make pornographic films on, is large, unwieldy, expensive, all of those things. That concentrates that kind of ability to produce in the hands of a small number of people. And equally, if you require a big projector, which is quite expensive, and you need a screen in order to show the films as well, that also limits who's going to be able to see it. So, it's as there are ways in which pornography has gone hand in hand with technological developments. And really, I think the biggest broadening out happens during the video era, and the fact that, people could purchase their own home videos, but also their own video players, which meant that more and more material could be seen. And also that actually, the 70s, the films that you mentioned, Debbie Does Dallas and Deep Throat, they're probably more of an anomaly than they are typical of porn production. If you think those are feature-length films, though they do conform in some ways to the kind of vignette type of film, pushed together, but they had a story that ran throughout. So, those are, and there are, I don't want to get into all of the history about those, but I think, there are lots of ways in which people will talk about pornography as having, no boundaries, that actually, if you open the floodgates, everything is available. Bestiality, child porn, all kinds of things. The fact is that the mainstream market and the main markets actually are pretty conformist, and I'm sure that there are niche areas. Well, of course, I know that there are niche areas of the web that are devoted to forms of pornography that other people, would see as totally outside of the pale. That child porn ought to be illegal, the bestiality ought and usually is illegal. But those things exist, but they're not, they haven't really, I don't think they've increased exponentially, even when there was opportunity to make that material once the kind of videos and things video players that we can use.
Let me just.
I'm sorry. I'm just feeling like I wish I'd kind of prepared for that question, really, because I think there's something that I ought to be able to say that's a bit more sensible than that.
That's fine. Let me turn away from the sexual aspect and the money aspect that you had mentioned. It seems to me that, at least in America, and that's where I've lived my life, it seems to me that there's almost as much resistance against pornography, and I'm not myself. I'm neither here nor there on pornography. If people love it, that's fine. Whatever. But it seems to me that, especially when I was a kid in the '70s, it was the money-making aspect that really threw people off. It's almost as if when pornography now is more acceptable when you watch it online, because people aren't making the quote-unquote big money the way they did in the '70s, when here in America, the distributors of pornography were the mafia, and organized crime. And it seemed to me that there was an outrage. Well, there's always outrage when money and sex are involved, whether you're a hooker or working in a pornography film or whatever. But what do you think that it's the money aspect that went along with pornography, at least in the late 20th century, that had a lot to do with its demonization? Rather than sex?
without a doubt, there's a whole range of critique that used to be thrown at pornography. You know, it makes more money than Hollywood and Bollywood and all the other film industries around the world combined. You know, those kinds of claims that used to be made. And at the start of the internet, you know, we would see that again. The pornographers are monetizing the web in ways that no one else can do. But I mean, that's no longer true. It's we still don't know what the proper money figures are actually for pornography, because there's such a lot of exaggeration. You know, there's a lot involved for
and how could you when private citizens are just, you know, having a weekend away with their friends, and they're all into that, and then they upload it, you know.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of free content around. There's also a lot of pirated content. We should be clear about that. You know, even if there isn't the same money being made, and certainly by production houses there's not as much money being made as might once have been made, though that was never massive amounts either. And certainly in a minute I'll give you a couple of anecdotes from the UK that might illustrate some of that. But there are companies that get pretty rich off pirated content, which are not paying for. They're not offering any kind of recompense to either the stars or the producers of that material, but because they provide a gateway for viewers, they can sell advertising or whatever else it is that they're selling on the back of those things, and so they are making money. So there is still quite a lot of money to be made, though I think that there has always been absolute exaggeration about how much money was being made. When I interviewed David Sullivan, who was a very important porn producer in the UK during the late 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, and a person who fought quite a number of censorship battles in the UK. He told me that if he'd had any idea that he could have made more money, he really felt like he couldn't charge a particular price point for his magazines, because he just didn't think that the market would take it. And it wasn't until he saw what price you could charge for a video or a DVD that he realized that actually he could have charged more for his magazines. And that the same happened at first with once, selling web access through memberships. He realized that he could have sold his DVDs for more money as well. So, kind of, there is an element of conservatism, I think, in what producers have felt that they could get away with without drawing too much attention to themselves. But, it is quite, the complaints about porn have not gone away, even as materials being made for free and circulated for free. There is still the worry about somebody is profiting off other people by making sexual content. So I think that aspect will never go away. But I don't think it makes it any less. I worry about the issues around exploitation and exploitative porn when stars are not being paid to perform, or the protagonists in any film, whether that's amateur, pro-am, or others, are being undercut. The amount that they can make, because actually, if you like a star, if you think what they do is good, they are offering you a performance, then they ought to be paid for that. That's my bottom line on this. So, and I never really understood the argument about they make so much money from this, that's what's wrong about it. If that's the case, why do we worry now that people make porn for free? the stigma still sticks, even if the material is available for free. But if somebody is putting their heart and soul into a performance, they ought to be recompensed for that.
So I want to pick up, we spoke about the money aspect and sort of the morality kind of issues, but two of the issues that also come up with pornography, especially related to women, of violence and misogyny and claims about that. And most I go back to like here in America, the Roe versus Wade decision. There was a woman, her real name was Jane Roe, and she was actually a dupe of the anti-abortion people. And in similar ways, the woman who was in Deep Throat, Linda Lovelace, I forget her real name, similarly came out. She came out against pornography too. And now there's a film coming out, a documentary about the Jane Roe, that she was paid by right-wingers to have her anti-abortion views. And it's also been suggested by some that the actress who went by Lovelace was also someone who made money campaigning or crusading against pornography later. I don't know if that's true, but it seems to me that a lot of those seem to have been overblown. What has been your take in your research, especially whether we're talking the golden age, so-called of pornography in the 70s and 80s, or now? You mentioned about people being underpaid, but my own take is, and I'll get into this a little later, is that the idea that women are being forced into sexual slavery on camera is way overblown. I mean, I'm not saying it might never have happened, but that's like saying that the women who walk the streets as prostitutes, they're just the tip of the iceberg. Most prostitutes aren't walking the streets.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, these are really quite fraught arguments, and also very, they're very polarizing arguments as well, around women and sex and being paid for sexual services, whether those are on camera or not. And I think, one of the biggest problems is around the ways in which women and sex are linked in a really horrible, stigmatizing kind of dance around whether or not women freely choose to engage in sex. And, there are, I think that there are probably remain some really bad actors in porn production, just as in almost every kind of work environment. There are people who seek to exploit their employees, who are happy to act in bad faith. And I think that, this happens in all kinds of industries. So it wouldn't be a surprise to me that it also happens in pornography or in prostitution. And then the question then for me is, well, how do you mitigate some of that? And you don't do it by banning that work, because basically it just goes even further underground than it already is. There's increasing stigma then, which increases the dangers for women who do engage in those kinds of activities. And I think, it's important to recognize that a lot of women do enjoy sex, and some of that number of women like to engage in forms of sexual performance for camera. Now, I don't think that pornography and sex work generally are to be absolutely conflated, but there are connections between the feminist arguments about sex work as a form of labour for which people are entitled to proper recompense. And the same is true of pornography, that performance and performers are entitled to a safe working environment. They should have the protections of labour laws and the usual labour laws, that if you sign a contract, the contract has to be fair and comprehensible by both sides of those signing it, that unfair work practices should not be in place. But none of this can be policed, though, given, the debates that we're having at the present moment about what is the role of the police in 21st century society. I'm really kind of, I feel like I want to stay away from that area at the moment, because I don't know that the police are necessarily friends of sex workers or people working in pornography. I think it is important that labourers in any industry have proper protections in law, and we haven't had that kind of discussion about what that would mean for people working in pornography. But it's not beyond our wit to be able to come up with wording around contracts, about working hours, about working conditions, about rights, about who you work with and don't work with. These are all things that happen in other industries, so I don't see why they can't happen in pornography. And the exploitative practices of the past and of the present, as they must still exist, are likely down to the ways in which pornography itself is stigmatized, but also, it's closely tied to the even bigger stigma around women and sex, and the idea that a woman is no better than she ought to be if she expresses any interest in sexuality. So I think we've got a long way to go, and we need to be having different kinds of conversations about what would constitute protections for men and women working in porn. And of course, those conversations are going to have to centre porn performers at their heart, right? It's not going to be just labour lawyers and policymakers wittering on about what would create a safe environment. The notion of the safe environment for a porn performer needs to come from porn performers, from their viewpoint.
I want to talk a little pop culturally for a moment, because we talked culturally a bit, but I had, in my email exchange with you, I had mentioned when I was a child, I was 5 or 6 years old, and I had grown up in an area of New York that was very similar to what you might have seen in a Martin Scorsese film like Goodfellas. And one summer, and it might have been the summer before I started school, it may have been my first summer as a child off, I remember some of the older guys in a warehouse 2 or 3 blocks from where I lived, had me and some of the other young boys go to the local delicatessen, gave us money and to bring food up to the warehouse. And we went up to the warehouse, and I remember seeing a lot of naked people. I'm like, boy, this is weird. And they were shooting a pornographic film in there. And the guy who was directing it, I didn't find out later, was a fellow named Buzz Kulik. And I don't know if you've ever heard of him, but he had done some Hollywood films. He had done, his most famous film was actually a television film that was quite famous here in America called Brian's Song, about a football player, an American football player who died of cancer. And I remember seeing a big poster of David Jansen, who was the actor in a TV show called The Fugitive that was big here in America. And he had directed a film called Warning Shot, which was a James Bond knockoff. And I remember walking around and seeing these people with the big 1970s bushes and whatnot walking around. I'm like, this is weird. And me and my friend are walking around. And I think I might have even, been given a little tour by this guy, Buzzgo. And it seems such an interesting kind of thing. You had the beads hanging from the doorways and everything. It was a very late 60s, early 70s love-in kind of thing. And I guess maybe that may have colored my own opinion of it, pornography not being that bad. But it makes me wonder, since Kulik himself, while he was never a big director like a Scorsese, name-wise, I wonder how many people in Hollywood ever participated in the pornography business. Because from what I found out later, Kulik, when he was in between films, apparently he may have had a drug problem, and when he was down on his money, he'd go off in between films and do 2 weeks, do a couple of pornography directions and make whatever they were paying directors at the time. Was pornography sort of Hollywood's dirty secret, do you think, in that there were people who were involved, cameramen, directors, and if not actually outright actors, that were involved in it but didn't want to be known for it?
Oh, I'm absolutely certain that that's the case. I mean, it's just inconceivable, isn't it, that there were these two parallel industries that
Yeah,
just had nothing to do with each other for decades. But actually, uh, when how often does somebody get a lighting job,
yeah,
or a makeup job or hair or whatever, all kinds of, all those ancillary industries,
yeah,
ancillary, I don't know whether that's the right term for it, but the
yeah.
ones, the behind the scenes activities in Hollywood must, people must have been moving backwards and forwards between those two spaces. I mean, I'm not a historian of American porn,
Yeah.
but I think that it's absolutely for certain that there will have been cross
Yeah.
fertilization,
Pollination.
cross pollination of
Yeah.
some kind, yes, and that people will have worked on both of those things. I mean, the equipment. If you're hiring equipment, who will you have been hiring it from?
Right.
Locations, all of those things. It's kind of yeah, the attempt to make out that porn has existed in the shadows, and anybody who's respectable has never crossed paths with it, it's a fiction. That's uh, it may well have been in the shadows, but it didn't mean that it wasn't there.
Yeah.
So I think it is. I'm sure your experience of that, of seeing quite well-known people working, will have been, quite a usual thing, I'm
Yeah.
sure. Yeah.
Well, I also want to talk here in America. And I don't know about Europe or the rest of the world, but in the 1970s, especially, I think pornography helped kickstart this sort of right-wing evangelical movement in America that coincided with anti-abortion views, that coincided with a number of other issues that led uh, to the state that America is in now. And I go back to the late 90s or mid to late 90s. I was living in Minneapolis, Minnesota at the time, and there was a woman named Nadine Strawson who was the head of the American Civil Liberties Union at the time. And she wrote a quite well received book called Defending Pornography.
Yeah.
And I remember at the reading, I listened to the reading, and then she took a question and answer session for 45, 50 minutes. And I remember a woman got up and started just attacking Strauss. And this was a woman my age, or maybe a little bit younger. She claimed that she had been a prostitute, forced into prostitution and pornography by her husband, this, that, and another thing. And having grown up where I grew up, as I mentioned, I could tell she was a plant, that she was a setup, that this woman didn't even know basic terms. And I called her out on it. And I remember afterwards I went up and Strawson thanked me for defending her, for defending pornography. And when I was leaving the store, this group of very angry feminists, I don't know if it was because they knew that I had exposed them. I remember a couple of them spat on me as I walked out of the store, and I just kept walking. But what role has that reactionary evangelical moralism played in the modern as a sort of against pornography now? Is it as bad in the UK or Europe as it has been in America?
Well, what's interesting about that kind of anti-porn campaigning is that it kind of it resurfaces all the time. It comes in waves, and so yeah, there's so for a while, uh, yeah, in that period, kind of the 1980s, which becomes known as the sex wars, that's really quite a very active period when feminist theorizing, feminist activism, and also evangelical and moralist groupings kind of come together to fight about porn as both a kind of moral, because certainly for the right wing evangelical groups, it is a moral issue. I'm not entirely convinced that it's a moral issue for feminist activists. Often it's about particular ways of thinking about men's relationships with women, and about porn being, that porn is the theory, rape is the practice. So, that it's teaching men to treat women as objects. That, right through the 80s, that was a really big feature. It had lots of activism going on, and then it kind of died down for a bit, and then it gets another resurgence, which seemed certainly in the UK. There's a difference to what was happening in the US, although we borrowed very heavily from a lot of the kind of feminist argumentation about pornography. But we never had the kind of hardcore materials that were available in the States, at least right up until really the turn of the century in the 2000s. That's really when we start to have legally available hardcore material. Prior to that is pretty softcore. And if there was anything that included actual sexual congress, moving images of people fucking, you had to travel to a licensed sex shop to be able to purchase that. There's never ever more than 200 of those shops in the UK. And so that could mean that, you might have to travel 30, 40, 50 miles, which might not seem a lot in the US, but it is quite a long way for us in the UK, to purchase a DVD or a video, and that, you couldn't be sure the shop would be open and all of those kinds of things. So the situation in the UK was quite different, I think, from the US. So we didn't have the same heat, I guess, to the activism in the UK until actually the advent of the internet, really. I think the internet and the availability of porn and the fact that it's so accessible and into people's homes has really caused a resurgence of that kind of activism. But also, of course, it's such a useful way of tamping down on people's freedoms, right? I mean, it's the best thing that you can bring out of your hat if what you want to do is prevent people being able to look at whatever they want online. So, saying that we've got to have controls on the internet, we've got to make sure that there are blockers and there's all kinds of tracking of people's activities. It's so much easier if you can say, well, it's because of the porn that's online. Yeah. Hardly anybody is going to stand up for the defense of porn. Even people who view porn a lot tend to say, well, there's too much of it around, or I'd rather that it wasn't available to kids. Even though the porn sites have done quite a lot, actually, to prevent young people's access to porn.
That's the whole do as I say, not do as I do kind of.
Yeah, but it's there's an awful lot of using porn as a kind of, it's a catch-all for all kinds of things that as a society we don't really like, and so that's one of the reasons why we end up with these kind of weird configurations of feminist activism working hand in hand with some of the most unbelievably reactionary Christian groupings, and they often are Christian. And actually, I think that's one of the, there's been an attempt to remoralize society, and certainly we saw some of that through the early part of the 1990s and up to now, where that has been more and more. There have been attempts to pass forms of legislation or to ensure that different kinds of activities, from education but through to legislation as well, that will prevent young people having access to sexual information. It's porn is lumped in with a whole range of other things, around same-sex marriage, abortion, etc. These are all things that evangelicals are pretty unhappy about. but it's less easy, I think, for them to say, well, actually, we don't like the way things are going with regards to same-sex relationships.
Yeah.
So we'll talk about porn, and we'll use the figure of the child as our kind of, a totem that people have to always acknowledge. Won't somebody please think of the children?
Yeah.
Well,
I want to talk a little bit about the future and technology, because that brings some precarious notions to play. We're getting to the point with computer animation that probably within the next decade or so, we could probably take someone like maybe a John Wayne or a Tom Hanks, and we could totally make a movie with them and their voices with just the imagery. And the same could, even if that real life actor is dead, we can do the same. We'll probably be able to do the same in porno. And this brings up questions. Is, let's say that we make a pornographic film that has an adult male sodomizing a 5-year-old computer child that has never really existed. It's not a real child. Or we have a pornographic film where we have a totally made up, seemingly real male who chokes someone, a woman, until she's dead in some kind of snuff film. And I mentioned snuff films, whether they're real or not is debatable. But when we talk about lawmakers getting all blown out of proportion, well, if we have Bugs Bunny, trying to fuck Elmer Fudd and do it, we know it's Bugs Bunny and Elmer Fudd. But if these are computer-generated images that look like us, and there's an effect called the uncanny valley, whereas automata or robots or anything that we see gets close to human, we get a little bit more nervous. But then as they get really close to humans, we don't get as much nervous. We start actually empathizing with these images. Talk to me if you know anything about research, or is this something that concerns people who study pornography, that technology might be the end of it in a sense? People might want to ban it because we're seeing John Wayne having sex with little Filipino boys that never existed.
Yeah. I mean, this is that has actually been on the agenda for quite some time, and in the UK, in fact, we have legislation that means that material, whether it's a cartoon or a story, a written story, those are illegal if they include children. Uh-huh. So the legislation already exists in the UK, at least, for the criminalisation of that kind of material. That doesn't, of course, take away the worries that there are about the fact that it will be possible to offer computer visualizations of individuals, and certainly it's something that people are beginning to be more and more concerned about in different ways, right? Yeah. That and in fact, actually, in the journal, we've just recently published a couple of articles which are about deep fakes and talking about the ethics of those, some of the issues that will arise as a result of deep fakes becoming more accessible and also much more difficult to recognize as fakes. There's always been forms of porn that circulated which might superimpose a celebrity's head onto a body, and that in the old days of kind of cut and paste imagery, as in photographs, you could do something quite clever, but you'd still see that the head didn't quite match or whatever, and so there was a kind of suspension of disbelief.
Well,
but I think
it also brings up some copyright issues too, because imagine, for example,
absolutely, yes.
I mentioned John Wayne, but imagine 20 years from now if we have sex bots, and let's say whoever's the great Hollywood sex symbol of then, that era's Halle Berry says, well, I'm going to I don't mind licensing my image to be used in a sex bot because she gets a lucrative deal. But then, someone does a porno with Halle's image, or the future Halle's image, and she doesn't like that and she sues that. But then again, is that parody? Maybe it's supposed to be a parody,
Well, I mean, it's such interesting questions that are raised by all of this, right? And in actual fact, there are stars who have suffered the theft of their intellectual property rights in their own image already. Scarlett Johansson, for example, is somebody who has been deep faked a lot. And I'm not entirely sure whether or not she has taken to law to do anything about it. But, I mean, certainly in the States, that kind of copyright law is constantly being updated, isn't it, to meet the needs of our kind of Photoshop and other kinds of tech production. I mean, in the 1980s, I think it was, there's a really famous case, which was about a woman who had been modelling as a lookalike, and she was sued by Jackie Onassis as being too like her, and so people couldn't tell the difference between the lookalike and the real Jackie O. And so that woman was prevented from pursuing a career as a lookalike model, right? So, I mean, I think, we are in for very interesting times. And certainly, there are really quite striking ethical issues about deep fake porn, and it's not just that it's the image, it is also that someone's voice can be manufactured, I guess, from various kinds of technology, so that you can have them saying things that they haven't said before. It's a broader issue than just porn, though, right? Because I mean, we live in this era of fake news, and deep fakes are something that can be done to kind of subvert the public sphere, really. So it's a very interesting set of questions. I don't have the answer for it, but as I say in the journal, we have a number of articles that are starting to tackle that issue. And be interesting to see how things develop.
Well, let me just close out this interview with asking just a couple of things. Number one, what do you think is in the immediate future in the next decade or two in porn studies? And what specifically are you working on next, either in that field or elsewise?
Okay. I'm glad you're not asking me what's the future for porn, because if I knew what the future for porn was, I wouldn't be studying. I'd probably be trying my best to get in there ahead of the curve. I probably shouldn't say that, actually, but anyway. In terms of porn studies, I think things like deep fakes are going to be really important. I think, there's an opening up as well of approaches towards porn, and thinking about different production environments for porn, because a lot of porn studies had been focused on things like the Golden Age, had been focused on American production of porn, and the Anglo-American kinds of debates about whether or not porn was a good thing. And I think things are opening up now, and there are voices from Asia who are talking about the specifics of pornography in those geographic locations. There's still the perennial issue around censorship, which will link to things like deep fakes, but also to virtual reality pornography. And so, there's ways in which technology will remain a really important aspect of porn studies. I'm still really interested in audiences for pornography. I still think that there's so much more that could be done around that, and thinking about how uh, people engage with porn. You know, if we're talking about pornographic deep fakes, what are the what are the interests that people have in viewing deep fakes, and particularly, you know, if we connect it to questions of authenticity, which has been one of the big buzzwords around porn, you know, about its realness and about is this an authentic image of pleasure, you know, and with deep fakes, often which actually still at the moment advertise themselves as fake, you know, what happens to the notion of authenticity in that regard, and what does that mean that people might be looking for when they're viewing deep fakes? It's yeah, there's just there's such a lot that can be researched, and you know, I'm really interested. We've currently got a call out at the moment for articles on sound in pornography, but also in the ways that, you know, not just sound in films, but also that sound itself, sound pornography, is becoming really quite popular, you know, with audible books of erotica, but also podcasts, and just really interesting to think about pornography as a kind of soundscape of sex. So, yeah, lots of things, loads of things. As the world keeps on turning, porn keeps on changing, different debates keep rising. I think that just it's a really fruitful area to be mining and exploring.
Well, I will link to your own personal webpage at the University of Sunderland. Anyone can contact you there. It was great to talk to you, and thank you very much for spending an hour or so speaking.
Okay, thank you. I hope that was helpful.